Okay, so we'll do commercial leasing today, and we'll talk about the process. When somebody calls and say, I need the commercial space, it's never as easy as it sounds. There's a lot of parameters. I'll give you some actual examples that we're dealing with right now. This is a flow chart that talks about the high level things. There will be some other things along the way that we'll talk about, but really, this is the process. The first thing that we have to do is start asking questions. The clients could have a lot of requirements that they think are insignificant and won't tell you until late in the process. And then you realize, okay, the place I'm working on is not relevant. For example, I'm working with a client right now that needs a commercial space for a lab kind of situation, an R&D facility, and they need heavy power, three-phase power or some significant 230 volt outlets. And if they don't tell me that up front, or I don't ask about it that up front, then I could go all the way down negotiating a lease only to realize that when we get to the place, they don't have that capacity to handle the power requirements that the client needs. So it all starts with needs analysis. What do they need? If they have a specific location, if they have any specific size, layout, budget. HVAC is a big thing in industrial. A lot of the places where you'll have either industrial warehouses or flex space or a mix between a front and a back warehouse. HVAC is a big question. Is it only AC area for the office, or is the warehouse itself AC as well? A lot of those clients don't really need AC in the warehouse area because the material they store in the warehouse is not climate sensitive, but some of them would actually require to have the entire space cooled under HVAC or heated because the merchandise or the product or the materials they're going to store in the warehouse part are climate sensitive. That's something to always ask. I mentioned power requirements or docking requirements. Do they get the merchandise from minivans or do they get it on big 18-wheelers? Do they need ground level docks or do they need truck level docks? Lighting, how lit the area is, security, do they need it to be fenced? Parking, do they need a lot of parking space? Do they need parking space that can accommodate trailers and trucks? A lot of other factors that are going to help you find the right spot for the right customer. And it starts with the needs analysis. This is the most important thing. So before you go to CoStar and Crexi and the MLS and all the other places where you can find spaces for lease, you really have to understand the requirements from your client. And even, yes, sometimes it means 4 or 5 emails back and forth asking questions and clarifying. It's okay, because it will save both of you a lot of time on the back end of things. So needs analysis is the most critical phase in this entire thing. Anything questions so far?
No, I'm good.
Awesome. Let's keep going. The next thing we do is we're going to research the market, right? So now that we know what our clients need, now let's go see what's out there. Are there any issues with the market? Are there any zoning issues that we're trying to get away with? Is there any product that even fit the client needs? Because sometimes the client will come back and say, I need this and that, but my budget is $15 a square foot, $10 a square foot, and the market he's looking at is $20+ per square foot. So going in and researching the market, making sure that there are properties that fit what our client needs is important. One of the biggest challenges in commercial real estate in general is that there's no standardization in what information the brokers present. So a lot of the time, your client might have a need for a tri-phase power, but none of the agents out there will tell you if the place have three-phase power or not. So what I usually do is I look at all their needs and I go through all the available properties and I basically put together a shorter list of properties that might fit the need. And then I send it to the client and say, hey, look, take a look at it. Let me know which locations you like, which kind of properties work for you, and look at the overall feel of those locations. Let me know if it fits. And if it does, then we'll take it to the next level and we're actually going to go and ask the questions that are critical for you: three-phase power, AC in the warehouse, and so on. I do an iterative process rather than I got all the requirements, I'm going to go through a million properties, I'm going to ask a million agents a million questions, and then I'm going to narrow down it to 4 or 5 and then give it to the client. Because by the time you're done all that work, those 4 or 5 properties might not even in the area the client wants. I'd rather let them look at a list when I don't necessarily know what's going on. And if it has all the requirements, if it meets all the needs, but it meets most of the needs that I could identify. And then I'm going to, once the clients filter the first level, I'm going to go out to those brokers and say, hey, do you have all these needs? What's the requested price per square foot? Because sometimes they don't even put the required amount and so on. I'm doing this, what we see over here between the market research and the present alternative. I do a little bit of a maybe 1 or 2 rounds back and forth with the client before we go to the brokers and actually get all the specific details. Once we've narrowed it down to a handful of properties that actually fit in the budget and meet all the other requirements that the client has, we're going into the tour properties, right? We'll go take a look. Sometimes we'll do it with the client. Sometimes the client is out of state or whatever, and it needs us to do a video tour. We'll do that with them. But that will put us down to maybe 1 or 2 locations that the client really wants to put an offer on. At that point, we make a proposal or an LOI, right? We put together a little bio for our clients to represent him in the best possible way. And then we're going to put an offer of what we're willing to offer. So sometimes the listing might say lease terms 3 to 5, but our clients might want a 2 or might want a 10, right? So in the proposal, we put the lease terms that we want to ask for. It's basically the beginning of the negotiation. In the analysis, we basically compare what are the options, where are we going with the negotiation, did we get what we want from this or the other property, but it puts the final terms of 1 or 2 properties in front of our clients to make a decision of, okay, which one are we going through. Next, we're gonna have to start working on 2 things in parallel. One is all the paperwork, right? The lease documents, the terms, any changes, because when you deal with, especially when you deal with the larger owners, the larger warehouses, the larger retail environments, the retail strips, and so the ownership is gonna give you their lease. They're not gonna use like a TAR or a TRIC or even an NTCAR contract for lease. They will have their own custom-made contract, which means our clients are going to have to read, review, and understand all the terms and all the clause in that contract. At the same time, we're going to go down the construction route, but this is optional. Sometimes you find a space that is just a perfect fit for your client and everybody's happy. Sometimes it requires work. So for example, when Old Navy or Gap or Banana Republic or whatever big retailer is moving into a retail strip and they take a space, that space is going to be just an empty shell. And they're going to build it to their spec. Same thing with our clients. If you're representing Banana Republic, that's awesome. And they'll run the show, trust me, on everything that has to do with the construction planning and pricing. But sometimes we work with small clients and they need help with planning the construction and planning the pricing. Construction sounds big and sounds scary, but in reality, it could be just, we need to change the flooring. We need to change the ceiling tiles. We need better windows. We need tinted windows. We need a cubicle here, or we need to close an office in the corner of that warehouse. It doesn't have to be massive and big. It could be as simple as changing the flooring, but everything has to be planned, priced, and negotiated with the ownership. Because 2 things have to happen. A, the ownership has to agree for everything we plan to do in the space. Because if you have a client that plans on breaking the concrete slab so he can build an underground bunker, that's not going to fly with ownership most of the time. And I'm giving an extreme example, right? In other cases, we change the flooring, maybe the ownership will have an idea of what kind of flooring they're willing or not willing to put in, what works with their plans and what doesn't work, what's sustainable, what's not sustainable. And then the other side of things is budgeting. So there is a term called TI, Tenant Improvement, and that goes with Tenant Improvement budget. In longer, bigger leases, right? I'm renting 15,000 square foot retail space for 5 years with 3 5 years options. Then it's common for the tenant to request a TI budget from the ownership. And that is basically, okay, if I'm coming in, I'm going to do all this work and I'm going to stay here for a long period of time. I want you to give me $20,000, $50,000, $100,000 in TI budget. So it will help me with the move-in costs, because it's going to cost me a lot of money to build a space and move in. Another thing that is common in these cases, especially when there needs to be done, work needs to be done, is negotiating a month or two for free at the beginning. Because if I'm a retailer, I got a store to sell, I don't know, shoes, and I need to prepare the space and do the build out and build the shelves and put new flooring and put a divider with the back room and so on, then it's going to take me a month or two to work on all these things, which means if I start paying rent today, it's money coming out of my pocket before I can start selling anything and generate income. So it's not uncommon to see commercial leases include a month or two upfront of free. So once all the negotiations are done and all the budgets are finalized and everything else is done, then we execute the lease document. The tenant gets the keys to the place, or it gets a timeline for the construction if the ownership is going to do the construction. And that's something that I didn't mention, but when it comes to doing changes to the space, either the ownership does the change or the tenant does the change. Depends on negotiation, depends on what the tenant feels. Some tenants will say, no, I got to do it my way with my materials and my supplies, so I know my quality. And then sometimes the ownership says, no, I want control over everything. Whoever does the construction is going to get started after the documents are released. There has to be monitoring, of course, and permits and all that going on. And then once everything is done, they get the keys to the new place and they move into it. The relocation assistance and implementation assistance, this is things that are not part of the leasing process, but they are part of customer service. If your client is opening a branch in, let's say, Dallas, Texas, but they're from California, they might need some help finding vendors or getting bids or meeting a vendor at the space to open the door and show them around and so on. This is a customer service that we might want to consider offering to our clients as we go along, because again, out-of-state client is not going to know any vendors in the area, is not going to be able to facilitate all those bids and so on. So sometimes we will have to do that for them. So this is the overall flow of a commercial lease, start to finish, from the minute you start talking to your clients all the way down to the point where they move to the new space. Obviously, there's a lot of things that can happen in iterations here. So we could tour a few properties after we've done all this process, and then none of those properties might fit. So we go back to square one of, okay, did I miss anything out of my needs analysis? Is there any new properties that might fit? And so on. So these are things that you want to make sure that you cover, and that, but you realize that this is not a one-way direction. Sometimes there will be iterations in that process. Any questions so far?
Nope.
Awesome. So let's talk about what kind of questions we ask a commercial tenant that approaches us. One of the most important questions is, who's the decision maker? Am I talking to the decision maker, or am I talking to somebody in charge of go talk to brokers and get me things, but I'll make the decisions? So that's an important question to know. Do you deal with the decision makers or not? Because otherwise you're just dealing with another chain, another link in the chain. We talked about, do we need any TI budget? What is their budget, lease duration, what they're looking for, how soon do they need to start the lease? So when you go to CoStar or Crexy, you will find things in there that are 6 months away from being vacated, that are a year away from being constructed. So knowing when your clients need to make the move is critical as you evaluate the available properties on the market. Notice that there's two different questions between when do you need to start the lease and when do you need to move in. What's the difference? The difference is when do we sign the documents and get the keys so we can start construction, and when do we need to move in, which means construction is done. Some clients would have a heavy construction process and a lot of requirements to prepare the space, so they might need 3 months, 4 months, 5 months lead time between getting the contract done and then moving in. Car parking needs. That's a very important factor. If I have a space that only has 20 parking spots, I can't lease it to a tenant that needs to put a gym or a grocery store or anything that is parking intensive, really, regardless of how big the space is. So that's a very critical questions to ask. One more question, a few more questions that I haven't had a chance to add over here yet, and then is technical requirements. We mentioned earlier the power, the AC, the docking. When it comes to warehouses, sometimes you got to ask questions, what's the thickness of the concrete slab that you need? Because certain concrete slabs are required, or certain thickness is required if you want to run forklifts on the slab. So if they deal with heavy materials, heavy products, heavy pallets, and they need to move with forklifts on the grounds of the warehouse, then that warehouse has to be constructed with a least amount of thickness in the concrete in order to support that weight. Otherwise, they will damage the slab. Location is critical, but don't just ask for where do you want it. Ask why do you want it over there? Is there any specific reason? Is there any specific limitation? What happens if I find you a great deal that is a little bit outside that area? Understanding the reasoning behind the location that they're asking for is really going to help you find them what they need in the best way. In office buildings or medical buildings, they'll ask for amenities. Sometimes they'll ask for utilities. Sometimes they'll have for infrastructure. Every different kind of asset class is going to have different nuances to it. So if you work in medical, for example, a dentist would require a bunch of underground infrastructure for gas and so on to operate their machinery and operate their chairs. Understanding if they're only working with you or they're working with multiple agents is a good question. Have they started looking at properties? Where are they looking at, and so on? These are all really good questions to ask. And really, the analysis phase, like I mentioned earlier, is one of the most critical ones in this thing. There are multiple ways, multiple leases. Like I mentioned earlier, you'll have different clients in different niches: retail, industrial, healthcare, multifamily, offices, and so on. So knowing what you're dealing with is going to help you a lot with finding what they need. Many agents are forgetting to have this conversation. When somebody tells you, I'm going to lease this warehouse for 5 years and I want 3 more 5-year options, it's a legitimate question to say, hey, have you considered buying a warehouse? The cost difference between lease and buy on the monthly payment is not going to be significant. The only difference would be, do they have the money to put the down payment up front in order to buy the property? Some of them might have the money, but just haven't considered buying a property because they've been leasing for 15 years already. So having those things, having that conversation, having the pros versus cons conversation on buying versus lease is a very legitimate question, even more so when dealing with commercial tenants than it is with dealing with residential clients. That's one thing. The other, a big advantage commercial tenants have when they're buying, because they're buying, they would buy a building and move their business into that building, there is a very high chance that they'll be able to qualify for an SBA loan. And an SBA loan can get them almost 80-something% LTV, loan to value, on that property, which really makes the conversation of buying versus leasing a very critical conversation. Now, any questions so far before I go into the types of leases?
No question.
Okay, awesome. So on the types of leases that you're going to come across, you'll see full service or gross lease, which basically means I am paying my rent and that's it. Everything is embedded into my rent. And the rent can be in terms of $2,000 a month, X dollars per month, or it could be as X dollars per square foot. So this is a very interesting distinction. When you are talking about a price per square foot, right? You might see somebody saying, okay, this warehouse is $12 per square foot, right? And then we'll talk about the other things. What does that mean? That means it's $12 per square foot per year. Okay? Which means if I have a 2,000 square foot warehouse, I will be paying how much? 12 times $12 per square foot times 2,000 square foot. That's $2,400 a year. And then I'm going to divide that into 12 months and I get $2,000 a month. Note that I just chose round numbers, that it works easier. But if I had a more ugly number for that matter, $13 per square foot, right? Then I would put 13 over here, and that would be $26,000. And then when I take the $26,000 and divide them by the 12 months, my monthly payment is going to be $2,166. Okay, so when somebody presents a lease rent asking price in terms of per square foot, it's per square foot per year, unless otherwise stated. Okay, so when I have a full service or gross lease, what I get quoted, that's all I'm going to pay, and that's it. See that in office buildings, see that in small retail stores, see that in any asset class where you have a very small, old school owner, because they don't want to deal with other things. They just want to say, I want $2,000 a month, I want $5,000 a month, and that's it. I'm dealing with the rest. Modified gross is, you're going to see this plus CAM. CAM stands for Common Area Maintenance, which means if the owner had to change the exterior lights, if they had to clean the parking lot, if the owner needs to pay for the dumpster to be clean, taken away every other week or every week or 3 times a week, whatever it is, the common area maintenance is getting charged back to the tenant, and it's a direct charge, right? So I can't, let's say the dumpster company, the waste management company is charging me $500 a month. I can't go turn around and charge $800 a month from the tenant. It has to be directly related with what I paid for. So that's the common area maintenance. You'll see that a lot in flex, in industrial, on the smaller side, sometimes in retail, and so on. A triple net or a double net or whatever it is really helps the ownership recover more costs back from the tenant. So the tenant pays the share of all operating expenses in addition to the rent. How will I see that in the listing? It will say like this, or it will have, I don't know, let's say 15.25 per square foot plus NN. So triple net, double net, single net is what is included in the chargeback. So chargebacks will have the maintenance, they can have the insurance, they can have the property taxes as well. So when you have a triple net lease, that means all 3 of those are charged back to the tenant. The maintenance, the taxes, property taxes, and the insurance. Absolute net comes down to...
Sorry, Joseph,
Yes,
I
go
lost you on this one. I wasn't paying attention. The triple net represent what?
The maintenance, the taxes, property taxes, and the insurance. So the tenant pays all of those, which basically helps the ownership move the risk over. So look at it this way. If I go ahead and I lease a warehouse, and that warehouse we have a contract for 5 years. For the next 5 years, I'm going to get my property taxes are going to go up because they go up every single year. And in the next 5 years, insurance more than likely is going to go up because insurance has been going up every year forever. I'm taking that cost increase, and instead of eating the difference every single year, right, I push it over to the tenant, and that helps the tenant secure a 5-year lease. Because if I had to take that risk on myself, I'll either ask a very higher, much higher price up front to account for those increases and account for that risk, or I would only give them a 1-year lease, knowing that next year taxes are going to be changed. I'm going to have to change the lease. So by moving those costs over to the tenant, I basically say, look, I'm willing to give you a long-term lease. This way you'll have the security that you won't have to find a new lease and move all your business somewhere else in 5 years. But I'm not taking the risk on the increase of the expenses. Now, in every contract, there's going to be clear definition of who's responsible for what in the contract. For example, HVAC. If the AC unit dies or needs service, who's responsible, the owner or the tenant? If there's a light bulb that burnt out inside the property, who's the response inside the business? Is the owner supposed to go in and replace the light bulb, or is the tenant responsibility? What if the toilet is clogged? What if there is a pothole in the parking lot? Exterior lights, signage, right? So all those things have to be defined in the contract, who's responsible to do what. And that comes the difference between triple net and absolute net. In modified gross and in triple net, the owner will do the common area maintenance, will be responsible of doing that maintenance, but can charge back the cost to the tenant. In absolute net, the tenant takes care of everything. So think about it this way. If a Starbucks leases a building, they don't want to wait for the landlord's handyman to show up. They don't want a landlord's contractor to do things the way the landlord tells them to do. They want their vendors to do things their way with their negotiated prices. So for Starbucks, it's better to say zero landlord responsibility. I don't want you to do anything. I don't trust you to do anything. And between you and I can negotiate a much better price than you. So I'm going to take care of everything. Now, they're not doing that out of their pure kind heart. Obviously, when you have a absolute net or zero landlord responsibility, the lease cap rate is going to represent, the lease is going to represent a much lower cap rate than the triple net, which will represent a lower cap rate than the modified gross, which will represent a lower cap rate than the full service. Any questions so far?
No.
Awesome. We're going to finish in a few minutes. Things to pay extra attention when looking at a lease. And it doesn't matter if it's a lease you're signing on behalf of the landlord, or you're signing on behalf of the tenant, or if you're helping a client buy an investment property that already has a long-term lease tenant in the building. Even in that case, we're going to help our client look at the lease. So what's important to look at? When does it start? When does it end? Does it have any options for renewals? What are the operating expenses? How do they get escalated? Who's doing what? Like I said earlier, who's responsible for HVAC, insurance? Do they have sprinkler systems? Do they require to have sprinkler system, right? Certain functions, if you want to put an event center in a big building, the city code is more than likely would have a requirement around fire suppression, exit, maximum capacity, and so on. So understanding all that and anchoring that in the lease is going to be critical. Insurance, like I said, what happens if any one of the parties defaults, right? What happens if the landlord is responsible for the HVAC? Can they leave the tenant without HVAC for 3 days? Where is all the requirements and all the things? Remember that when it's a residential property, like an apartment or a house, there are city codes around what you can and cannot do, and how you have to handle things and how fast you have to handle things. There's a lot less protections for the commercial tenants. So that's why making sure that the contract is clear on all these things is critical. Subletting and assignments, is it allowed or not allowed? And if it is allowed, then what's the terms? Hazardous waste, ADA compliance, everything else, right? I'm not going to go through all of that, right? Zoning, right? One of the most critical things, and that happens in your research phase, is to make sure that the property has the right zoning for what your client is trying to do. So if your client is going to create a nuclear fission lab in the middle of a neighborhood, that's not going to happen, even if you can fit all this thing into a 3,000 square foot retail store. It's just not the right zoning for that, right? Certificate of occupancy is critical, like I mentioned earlier, tenant improvements, and so on. Like I mentioned earlier, in the triple net and modified gross and the absolute net, right? Property taxes, property insurance, who's paying for them, how it's getting paid, and so on. Who's doing the maintenance, who's responsible, is there a property management company, or who do the tenant basically needs to contact in case of emergencies, who pays utilities, what kind of utilities are available, and so on. Janitorial cost is usually in office buildings. The rest is not really interesting here. I'm going to wrap it here. There's a lot of information. If you're watching this video and have any questions, feel free to reach out. Awesome. So I'm going to stop the recording now, and thank you, everybody.